now going to come to our main consideration of its principal section, which is those chapters that make up basically collections of individual sayings about various topics. We might have appreciated if these sayings had been gathered into topical arrangements for us, because when you're thinking about a given topic, it's kind of at least the way our minds work, we like to synthesize the information. We like to get things, the whole picture on something, rather than get a little piece of it and then look at several other subjects, and then eventually get another piece of that topic and have just sort of a patchwork of different sayings that are kind of not organized in any logical fashion. And yet that's how Proverbs has come to us, and that's one way it can be studied. We could go verse by verse through it and just keep returning to certain subjects over and over again at random points where they appear. I think, however, though, to gather the wisdom in that section, it'd be in many ways more profitable to just look at it in topical arrangements. There are certain subjects that we can take all the verses in Proverbs about and see the whole teaching of Solomon, the whole wisdom of Solomon on that topic. And so in your notes, I have given you sort of a topical arrangement into major themes. The first of which is entitled Wisdom. And there it says, see separate sheet number 1 on your notes. There is a separate sheet number 1, but I'm not going to give it out because we're not going to take this, because we basically looked at most of the matter when we went through very much detail in chapter 9. There is more, but in a sense all of Proverbs is about the subject of wisdom, but the first 9 chapters focus on that as a principle itself, and what we would have covered in sheet number 1 has almost all been covered in our earlier lectures. So we're going to skip that. Not so much skip it, but consider it to be already covered. And the second theme in my notes is God-conscious living, which is divided into many subtopics, as we shall see. And the third general theme is one of attitudes and mood management. So the inward life, things like anger, envy, jealousy, resentment, depression. Those are subjects that are addressed, and we'll look at those separately. Then, of course, there's a lot of Proverbs about human relationships, parent-child relationships, husband-wife, servant-master, ruler-subject, friends and brothers, enemies, neighbors. Lots of Proverbs on those things we'll be looking at. And then there's the rest of it that I want to talk about when we get to it, and that'll be, of course, many lectures hence, will be on avoiding the world's traps, which are the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Now, Solomon doesn't list them that way. John does in 1 John chapter 2, but we do find that those are the things that he addresses. There's quite a bit there about the lust of the flesh, which includes food obsession, drug or alcohol abuse, sluggardliness, or sexual temptation as well. The lust of the eyes is about greed. We'll have a separate sheet on that. And then the pride of life, the whole issue of pride and arrogance and its relationship to one's relationship with God and people. Anyway, those are the various things we're going to look at. You can see that almost all the realms of life are covered, but the first we are going to cover is the first that is introduced, which is God-conscious living. I say it's the first one introduced because right at the very beginning of the book of Proverbs, in chapter 1, verse 7, it says, the fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. So, to live a wise life, Solomon believes you must first of all live a God-conscious life. And when we say God-conscious, this does not mean simply that people believe there's a God. The majority of people in the United States, when they are polled, tell us that they believe there's a God. But do they believe this God has any involvement in daily decision-making? Do they believe that God is watching everything, listening to everything? That the hairs of your head are numbered? That every idle word you speak, He's recording for a later reckoning? How involved is this God? How near or how far in the thoughts of the individual. Solomon indicates that the wise man is one who is God conscious in all his life. He says to be in the fear of the Lord all the day long. And so it's not just a matter of believing there's a God and not being an atheist. Many people are not atheists in their stated beliefs, but they are practical atheists because day by day they live their lives, they make their decisions, they contrive, they worry, they have all kinds of reactions to their environment in which God does not come into consideration. God is not in all their thoughts. So Solomon, of course, believes there is a God, and yet it's not enough just to know there's a God. You have to be aware of God. You have to have the knowledge that God exists impacting all of your thinking. That's the God-conscious life. Many people who are Christians today, they go to church and they remember God on Sundays as He's brought to their attention again. But during the week, He's really not in their thoughts. And I was talking to somebody not long ago, and I don't remember who, it might have been one of you here, I don't remember, but they were saying that they were among some Christian businessmen. And those businessmen were simply saying that, maybe it was Gary's telling me that they separated their Christian convictions from their business life. And they considered that their business life needed to be run by different principles of wisdom and prudence than their Christianity, and that meant they didn't conduct themselves entirely honestly or in a principled manner in business. And it's obvious that these men believed in God. They were in a Christian fellowship of business people. But they did not consider that God had to be in their reckoning, in their daily activities of business. They lived as practical atheists, and then would come and remind themselves about God on occasion when they go to church. That is not wisdom. That is foolishness. Now, there's many aspects of God consciousness that Solomon wants to advocate, the first of which, as I mentioned, is the fear of the Lord. And there are a number of proverbs that deal with or bring this matter up. The first of which we have seen, and I've already mentioned even today, it's in Proverbs 1:7, where he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Despising wisdom and instruction means you're not teachable. You don't want to be corrected, even if you're wrong. But if you fear God, you don't want to be wrong. You might not enjoy being instructed and being told you're wrong. It's humbling, but on the other hand, you'd rather experience that humiliation than continue to be wrong. You're courting disaster because God wants you to go the right way. If you fear God, as I've said earlier in one of the earlier lectures, fearing God doesn't mean you live always terrified about God, thinking that He's against you and that He's your enemy and that you have to beware of Him at every moment. But rather, you live with the consciousness that God is powerful, that living in harmony with Him is the only safe thing to do, and it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It's a fearful thing to be on the wrong side of God, but it's not necessary to be on the wrong side of God. You have a choice about it. It's as I was saying about traffic. As long as I'm in harmony with it, as long as I'm in the right relationship with it, if I'm going the same direction as the traffic, I hardly give it a thought. I don't live in fear. But let me hit the patch of black ice on the freeway, as I have done on occasion, and my car starts sliding sideways and turns around. I'm facing the oncoming traffic for a moment. They slide around, and there's no control. I don't have any control over my relationship to the rest of traffic here. And that makes your heart beat fast. Once you come safely to a stop from that, if you're fortunate enough to do so, you realize for the first time how fast your heart is beating. Like, wow, that was terrifying. I didn't realize it. But you see, you're driving along without any fear at all most of the time. But when you find yourself not in right relationship with the traffic, then you realize what a terrifying thing it is. How powerful traffic is to destroy if it is not the case that you and traffic are on the same path. And that is how God is. He's powerful to destroy. And a person who follows God and is on the right relationship with God can do so without fear. But the thought of maybe doing the wrong thing and making God upset with you or being on the outs with God, that's a terrifying thing. It should be. Anyone who doesn't fear God is not in touch with reality. They don't know what's going on. It's the beginning of knowledge. And that's the first thing about God-conscious living, is that we have to live with the fear of the Lord as our awareness. In Proverbs 8:13, Solomon said, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Now, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Why? Because when you know and fear God, you realize that evil is the thing that puts you in the wrong relationship with Him. To become an evil person is to basically invite God to be your enemy. It says that in the book of James, it says, whoever will be the friend of the world will be the enemy of God. Nobody who has any intelligence wants to be the enemy of God, because you've got an enemy who can overwhelm you easily and destroy you. So you hate evil because you see evil as that thing which offends God. You see evil as that thing that puts you at odds with God. And so the fear of God causes you to, when you contemplate the thought of evil, to hate it. And it's obvious then when Christians actually succumb to sin, knowingly, if they do, that is, if they know the thing they're doing is wrong, then at that moment they're not fearing God as they should. By the fear of the Lord, we will find men will depart from evil as well as hate it. In chapter 14 and verse 26, Solomon said, the fear of the Lord, in the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence, and his children will have a place of refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, verse 27 says, to avoid the snares of death. So a person who actually has the fear of the Lord is not intimidated and fearful and insecure. A person who has the fear of the Lord is actually very secure. Because by the fear of the Lord they avoid evil, and therefore they know that they're on good terms with God. And that makes them not fear what men will do to them. In chapter 16, verse 6, Solomon said, in mercy and truth, atonement is provided for iniquity. But by the fear of the Lord, one departs from evil. As the fear of the Lord, of course, inclines one to hate evil, it also inclines one to depart from evil. And this, of course, is talking about departing from a lifestyle of evil, departing from a life of rebellion and hostility toward God, and one that invites His hostility. You fear God adequately, you're smart, you depart from that way of life that is going to bring His wrath upon you. In chapter 23, in verse 17, it says, do not let your heart envy sinners, but be in the fear of the Lord all the day long. So again, this is something that many people are not wise enough to do. They think of God occasionally. But the fear of the Lord should be on your mind, at least governing you, perhaps not in the forefront of your mind. You're not always thinking about how much you fear God. But it's always there as a gyroscope to keep you from getting off the tightrope, getting off the narrow way, realizing that I'm not afraid as long as my feet are where they're supposed to be. But a misstep could be disastrous, and that is in the back of my mind all the while. And that keeps me all the day long seeking to do the thing that will avoid those things that are fearful about falling into the hands of God. Avoid those sins that will make God feel like He must discipline me or judge me. In chapter 28, in verse 14, Solomon said, happy is the man who is always reverent. In the King James says, who fears always. And the word reverent there is the word fear. Reverence and fear, a lot of translators want to translate the fear of the Lord as reverence. Because obviously reverence is an aspect of that. If you fear God, you hold Him in awe and in reverence. But actually, it says here, happy is the man who fears always. The New King James says, who is always reverent. But he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity. So always fearing God. Always reverent toward God. This is a daily, all-day consciousness of God in the life. And this particular aspect of our awareness of God is that which that appreciates the danger of offending God. And though we are saved by grace, and we know that that God loves us, and we're justified by faith and all of that, and although we therefore don't, live in constant fear of losing our salvation, I don't think we do. Although, frankly, if we ever contemplate abandoning Christ, that fear of loss should be something that catches us before we go far in the wrong direction. But we don't live our lives fearing that we'll lose our salvation, but we do know that God is a Father who disciplines. A child often fears his father's anger without fearing that his father will disown him. Many times he knows that when he does wrong, his father, when he gets home, is going to take him out and give him a sound beating. Not so much anymore. It used to be the way in ancient times and even relatively modern times. People don't spank their kids so much anymore. But a child who knew that his father was going to bring discipline on him when he got home was fearful. And in many cases, children have contemplated doing things that they knew were wrong and decided not to, because they knew that their father would be angry. And although it's not being disowned that they fear, it's the fact that he is not going to disown them and he's going to take them up as a project to correct them and discipline them. That's what they fear. And so we also, our fear of the Lord is not so much that we're afraid God's going to reject us or disown us or send us to hell. Almost more terrifying is that he's not going to do that, and he's going to work on us. He's going to shape us. He's going to discipline us. He scourges every son that he receives, it says in Hebrews chapter 12. Not the ones that he rejects. The sons that he doesn't reject are the ones he scourges and chastens. So the Christian's fear of God is not so much, fear of hell. Though there is that, if in the extreme, if a person decides that they're thinking about just abandoning Christ and doing their own thing, going back to their life of pre-conversion, narcissism, well, the fear of hell should be a consideration. But even a good Christian who would never consider abandoning Christ often is tempted to do things that are wrong. And it is that awareness that God will discipline his children. And it's not always fun when he does. In fact, no discipline for the pleasant seems joyous but grievous, Hebrews 12 tells us. It says, afterward, it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness in those who are exercised by it. But at the time, it's grievous. And the fear of being taken to the woodshed, so to speak, the fear of being, facing your dad who's going to discipline you for your misbehavior, that fear should be in you all the time. Always reverent toward God. That's the mindset that should be 24/7. If a person is to have a God-conscious life, among the things the person is conscious of is God's commitment to end evil in our lives. And if we side with evil, then we are siding against him and looking for some serious trouble. Now, he also talks about the knowledge of God, and this is connected with the fear of God. The two are connected in Solomon's mind. If you don't fear God, you don't know who God is. And the knowledge of God, as we've said before, is not the same thing as knowledge about God. Just like the fear of God or the consciousness of God is not just, having a theological belief in a proposition that there's a God, but it's a knowledge that God is there, that he's involved and you're involved with him. That in all of life, God is present. And every detail of life is a matter of his interest. So also the knowledge of God is not just knowing about God and having theological opinions that are correct about God. That is never brought up in Proverbs as a priority. Not that it is, not important. But I think Solomon assumed that most of the Jews who believed in God had the same belief in God that he had, the God of Moses. The God that was revealed through Moses and through the Pentateuch and the Torah. So that God, they know who he is. Their theology is not the problem. The question is, do they know him personally? Are they in a relationship with him? And knowing God has to do with getting acquainted with God as a person, not simply becoming acquainted with the facts about God as a subject of study. And so in Proverbs 2, and we saw this passage in an earlier lecture, verses 1 through 5, he said, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." Understanding and finding the fear of the Lord and the knowledge of God. Now, some people find it easier than others to fear God. Some people actually are kind of just fearful of God almost from their childhood. Not very many, perhaps, but there are some who are. The fear of the Lord is not always hard to find, but it may be hard to understand what it involves. But finding the knowledge of God is something that is not the easiest thing in the world. Because knowing God means you cultivate a relationship with Him. And just like you would cultivate the relationship with a friend or with a spouse, or with your parents or your child, with another human being. Now, God is not another human being, and that's what makes it difficult. It's hard enough to cultivate a relationship with another person, especially if they're a person who wants to be involved in every aspect of your life, and one who you wish very much not to cross or to offend. Somebody whose happiness is at the center of your concerns. You make it a project for life to discover how to make such a person happy if they're your spouse. And so that kind of knowledge of a person is a lifelong project. It's demanding. And it's made the harder by the fact that God is invisible. And He doesn't always speak audibly. And knowing God, getting to know God, has its challenges that even are greater than getting to know a person. That is a human person. God is a person. But the idea here is that it takes some kind of determination. You have to cry out for wisdom. You have to seek for her as for silver or for hidden treasures. If you have that kind of determination, if you have that kind of priority that you give to knowing God, then you will find the knowledge of God. God is findable. God is knowable. Now, agnostics are people who say they don't know if there's a God or not. They're unaware. But some agnostics go so far as to say no one can know. In which case they're not really ordinary agnostics, they're ornery agnostics. An ordinary agnostic just says, I don't know if there's a God. That's what agnostic means, is don't know. But an ornery agnostic says, I don't know and you can't know and no one can know. But I would dare say they simply have given up on the inquiry too soon. To say, I don't know and you can't know, you're saying, well, I haven't put out the effort to find God. And you can't find Him no matter how much effort you put out for it yourself either. But how do they know that? It's very clear that they have not sought for Him with all their heart, because God has promised in Jeremiah, you will seek for me and you shall find me when you search for me with all your heart. That's what Solomon is saying very clearly in chapter 2. You want to have a God-conscious life, and this is easier to do once you have gotten acquainted with God. And it's not, if you simply have a theology that there's a God there, and even that He's going to judge, and so you fear God all day long, but you never really get acquainted with Him. You just know there's a danger out there of doing the wrong thing, and there's a God who someday will smack you for it. That's better than nothing, in the sense that way you're at least not an atheist. You at least have the good sense to try to not do the kinds of things that are going to bring harm upon you, and because you court disaster and enmity with God. The fear of God's a good thing, but you need to get to know Him too. And of course, once you get to know Him, you find that God is love, and we love Him because He first loved us, and perfect love even casts out fear. That is, the sense of being afraid is eliminated by the fact that we know that He loves us and that we are loving Him, and that we are therefore in a relationship harmonious with Him. And we have an acquaintance with Him like we have with a father, or with a spouse, or with somebody who's a good friend. That is something that not everybody has, and it does not come without giving it a priority. We must give time to God. We must make that, we must define the pursuit of God as our chief value and chief goal. That's what certainly Solomon says in these verses. You need to treasure the knowledge of God. And then you'll find it. God is not so easy. He's not cheap as to just throw himself at somebody who has a casual interest. He's worth more than that. He knows it. And anybody who doesn't value him that much, not going to find him. But a person who loves him and loves the truth and desires to know him and makes that the priority of life, then they will find the knowledge of God, Solomon said. And in chapter 9 and verse 10, again, the fear of the Lord is connected with the knowledge of God here. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So you begin to have wisdom and understanding by fearing God. But when you come to know him, then you really have understanding. You really do know what's going on. In the sense, you see the world through a different lens. It really does change everything in the way you look at everything. You understand the world differently when you know God than when you don't. You're trying to figure things out without God. Solomon himself went through a season where he tried to figure it all out without God. And that's what the book of Ecclesiastes documents. That he spent years of his life seeking the chief good of man, considering only things, as he puts it, under the sun. That is, earthbound considerations, not things above the earth, not God, but just from earthbound considerations. He looked into virtually everything that promised to have meaning and that promised satisfaction, whether it was sensual pleasure or philosophy or money or whatever. He tried it all, and he said again and again, this is emptiness. This is just nothing. It's hollow. It's like striving after the wind. When you look for the meaning of life in these things under the sun. But of course he came through that period of time and realized that, as he said at the end of Ecclesiastes, what is the conclusion of the matter? Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. So fearing God, knowing God, that's where understanding of things comes from. When you're trying to understand the world without God as the focal lens through which you're seeing it, then you don't understand. But the knowledge of God is understanding. And so the God-conscious person has begun by fearing God and has proceeded to get the knowledge of God. Now, when you know God, that means you're going to know a number of important things about God. And this knowledge about God is going to color your behavior, just like as you get to know your husband or your wife, or as a young child grows to know his parents, you become aware of what things, what they're like, what their predictable reactions are going to be to certain things, and you adjust your behavior according to what you know offends them or what you know pleases them. And so Solomon has quite a bit to say in terms of what we know about God as we know God. See, I made a contrast between merely knowing about God and being acquainted with God. It's the same contrast as if you read a biography on our president, but had never met the man. You would know a great deal about him. You might even say, I know this man very well. I've read 3 biographies of him. I've read I think 5 biographies of George Mueller. I feel like I know him well, but I've never met the man. He died before I was born, and he doesn't know me, and I wouldn't recognize him on the street, probably. I guess I might have seen pictures of him, but the point is, he's not really a friend. I just know a lot about him. And there's a difference between knowing a lot about a person and knowing that person so you're actually in communion with them, and they are drawing from, and you are drawing from that relationship, mutual satisfaction, mutual edification. That's a different kind of knowing. Yet, that second kind of knowing is not without the first kind. That is, if you're acquainted with someone, it's not like you don't know about them. That's when you get to know someone, you want to know everything about them. When you want to have a harmonious relationship with someone, you want to discover what makes them tick. You want to know what's going to make them happy. When you fall in love with somebody and think about having a life with them, you want to get all the facts you can about maybe their background, their dreams, their values, All these things, because this knowledge about them simply fills out the content of your knowing them as a person, and informs your knowledge of how to relate with them. And so in Proverbs, there's a number of Proverbs that tells things about God, which are part of the mental furniture of somebody who knows God. He knows about God in ways that other people would not. The first thing, of course, is the idea of the sovereignty of God. And there's a number of Proverbs that talk about the sovereignty of God. Quite a few of them are in one chapter, and that's chapter 16. Now, when we say the sovereignty of God, this term means different things to different theologians. What the term means at its root, sovereignty means the one who's in supreme authority. Supreme authority. And what that means is that they answer to nobody. The person who is sovereign does what he wants to do. And he never has to answer to somebody who says, now, why'd you do that? He's not accountable because he's sovereign. He's at the top of the food chain. A king in a society, a lord over his household, a father over his children, are examples of persons who are at the top of the authority structure and essentially makes decisions for the rest without having to consult others. Now, obviously, I say without having to. In many cases, the Bible advocates that a king ought to seek counsel, and certainly a man should seek counsel from his wife, and so forth. But the point is, his position is such that he can act unilaterally if he wishes. He's in the role where he has that right. If he's wise, he won't act hastily without taking counsel from other concerned parties. But at the same time, he can. That's what his position means. That's what a sovereign is. He's the absolute authority. Now, the Bible doesn't use the word sovereign in speaking of God.